The clock struck 3 a.m., and the shadows started moving. If you like the story, please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. Also, it would be fun if you let me know what time it is when you watch it. Let's begin. It started with a single night, one of those restless evenings when sleep felt just out of reach. Alex stirred in their bed, the stillness of the apartment broken only by the faint hum of the fridge and the distant sound of passing cars. Groggy, they glanced at their bedside clock. The bright red numbers glared back at them. 3 a.m. Alex let out a soft groan and rolled over, trying to settle back into sleep, dismissing the wake-up as a coincidence. The next night, the same thing happened. Alex woke suddenly, their heart racing for no apparent reason. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, a family heirloom that had been in their home for years. Again, the clock by their bed read 3 a.m. A chill crept up their spine, but they told themselves it was nothing. People woke up randomly all the time, didn't they? By the fourth night, Alex couldn't ignore it anymore. Something felt off. They had gone to bed at their usual time, exhausted from the day, but they woke again to the exact same sight, the glowing red numbers reading 3 a.m. This time, though, the room felt different. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the shadows cast by the dim light from the street seemed darker, thicker than usual. As the days turned into weeks, the pattern persisted. No matter how tired Alex was, no matter what time they went to bed, they would wake at 3 a.m. on the dot. It wasn't just the time that unnerved them, it was the strange sensations that accompanied the waking. Their heart would race as though they had just run a marathon, their skin prickling with unease. The once familiar comfort of their bedroom felt alien, like a place they didn't quite belong in anymore. One night, Alex decided to investigate. They sat up in bed, their body tense, listening intently to the silence. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. It sounded unusually loud in the quiet apartment. Alex's eyes darted around the room, scanning the familiar shapes of furniture and belongings. But something about the shadows seemed wrong. They didn't move as they should, didn't follow the natural patterns of light and darkness. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. But the longer Alex stared, the more certain they became. The shadows were moving. The realization sent a jolt of fear through Alex. They blinked, shook their head, and turned on the bedside lamp. The warm glow of the light chased away the darkness, and the shadows returned to their normal shapes. Alex let out a shaky laugh, scolding themselves for being so paranoid. "It's just your imagination," they muttered, turning the light off and lying back down. But as soon as the room fell dark again, the feeling returned, an oppressive weight in the air, as though something unseen was watching them. The next morning, Alex tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe they were just tired, their mind playing tricks on them. They told themselves it was stress from work, coupled with their lack of sleep. But deep down, they knew there was more to it. The waking at 3 a.m., the heavy atmosphere, the strange behavior of the shadows, it wasn't normal. Over the following nights, the phenomena grew worse. Alex began waking up not just with a racing heart, but with a faint ringing in their ears, as though the silence was too loud. The shadows in their room seemed to shift more noticeably, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. One night, Alex swore they saw something move in the corner of the room, a faint, flickering shape that disappeared as soon as they turned on the light. The grandfather clock became a focal point of Alex's unease. Its ticking, once a comforting background noise, now felt invasive, almost threatening. The sound seemed louder at night, echoing through the apartment like a heartbeat. Alex began to wonder if the clock had something to do with the strange occurrences. After all, it was the only object in their home that marked time so precisely, chiming softly every hour. Could it somehow be connected to the pattern of waking at 3 a.m.? Desperate for answers, Alex started researching online. They typed phrases like waking up at 3 a.m. every night and unexplained shadow movement. Most of the results were generic explanations: stress, insomnia, even spiritual theories about the witching hour, a time believed to be ripe for supernatural activity. Alex dismissed the superstitions, but the thought lingered in the back of their mind. What if there was something to it? One forum post caught Alex's attention. It was from someone who described waking up every night at the same time, accompanied by strange sensations and moving shadows. The thread had dozens of replies, most from people sharing similar experiences. But one comment stood out. It was from an anonymous user who wrote, "If you're waking up at 3 a.m. and the shadows are moving, it's already started." Pay attention to the clock. Time isn't what you think it is. The cryptic message sent a chill through Alex. They tried replying to the user for more information, but the account had been deleted. Frustrated and unsettled, Alex spent the rest of the night scrolling through the thread, but no other comment seemed as specific or as ominous. The next night, Alex decided to stay awake until 3 a.m. to see if they could catch the moment when the shadows began to move. They sat in bed with the lights off, the faint glow of their bedside clock the only illumination. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the apartment, each sound amplifying Alex's anxiety. When the clock struck 3 a.m., the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen, pooling in the corners like liquid darkness. Alex's breath hitched as they noticed movement, slow, deliberate, unnatural. The shadows weren't just shifting randomly. They were reaching, stretching toward the bed. Panicking, Alex turned on the bedside lamp. The light banished the shadows instantly, but the oppressive feeling remained. Alex sat frozen, their heart pounding. They had seen enough to know that this wasn't a trick of the mind. Something was happening, something tied to the clock in the strange hour of 3 a.m. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that their room had become a stage for something unseen, something wrong. Each night, as the clock struck 3 a.m., the shadows seemed to thicken, pooling in the corners of the room like ink spilled on the walls. At first, Alex tried to rationalize it, tricks of the mind, an overactive imagination. But the movement was undeniable. The shadows didn't just flicker with passing headlights or the faint glow of the street lamp. They moved deliberately, shifting in ways that made Alex's skin crawl. One night, as they lay wide awake in bed, Alex noticed a shadow in the far corner of the room that didn't belong. It was darker than the rest, almost solid, and it didn't shift with the light from passing cars outside. It simply stood there, unmoving, like a stain on reality. Alex stared at it, their chest tightening as a creeping dread took hold. They turned on the bedside lamp, bathing the room in warm light. The shadow was gone. Relief washed over Alex, but it was short-lived. The next night, the shadow returned. This time, it seemed larger, its edges sharper, more defined. It didn't stay confined to the corner either. Alex swore it crept closer, inching forward with each passing minute. They stayed frozen in bed, too terrified to move, watching as the darkness seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like it was alive. By now, Alex's fear had grown into a full-blown obsession. During the day, they searched their apartment for anything that could explain the strange phenomenon. They examined every piece of furniture, every angle of light, trying to find something that could cast such a distinct shadow. But there was nothing. No object, no source. It was as though the shadow existed independently of the physical world. The grandfather clock in the hallway became a focal point of Alex's anxiety. Its ticking had always been a steady, comforting rhythm in the background of their life, but now it felt oppressive, invasive. The sound seemed louder at night, echoing through the apartment like a sinister metronome. Alex began to wonder if the clock was somehow tied to the shadow. After all, it was the only constant, the one object that marked the passage of time so precisely. And every night, as the clock struck 3 a.m., the shadows began to move. Desperate for answers, Alex tried staying awake again. They sat up in bed, staring at the shadow in the corner, determined to understand its movements. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. As the minutes crawled by, Alex noticed something unsettling. The shadow didn't just shift randomly. It seemed to respond to the sound of the clock, moving slightly with each tick, as though the rhythm was guiding it. When the clock chimed 3 times, the shadow grew darker, more pronounced. Alex's breath hitched as it began to stretch across the floor, creeping toward the bed. It stopped just short of the edge, pulsing faintly, almost as if it were waiting. Alex couldn't sleep that night. They kept the lights on until dawn, their heart pounding every time they glanced at the corner of the room. The shadow had retreated when the sun rose, but the memory of its movements lingered. It wasn't random, Alex realized. It was deliberate, purposeful. The next day, Alex decided to test a theory. They covered the clock in the hallway with a thick blanket, hoping to muffle its sound. That night, they lay in bed, waiting for 3 a.m. When the time came, the room felt eerily still. The shadow didn't appear, and for the first time in weeks, Alex felt a glimmer of hope. But the following night, the shadow returned. This time, it wasn't confined to the corner. It stretched along the walls, its edges flickering like flames. Alex's chest tightened as they realized the shadow was no longer following the clock's rhythm. It was moving on its own. One evening, while inspecting the clock, Alex noticed something strange. The interior of the clock, visible through a glass panel, had faint scratches on its wooden surface, as though something had been clawing at it from the inside. Alex's pulse quickened. The scratches hadn't been there before, of that they were certain. It was as though the clock itself was changing, evolving along with the shadow. Determined to find answers, Alex turned to the internet again. They typed in phrases like moving shadows at night and haunted clocks, but most of the results were generic ghost stories or urban legends. One post, however, stood out. It was from a forum discussing unexplained phenomena, and the title read, "The Shadow in the Corner, a Warning." The post described a figure that appeared in the corner of a room at night, growing stronger with each passing hour. The writer claimed the shadow was tied to a cursed object in their home, a clock that had been passed down through their family. They warned that the shadow wasn't just a harmless presence. It was an entity, a parasite feeding on fear and attention. The more you acknowledged it, the stronger it became. Alex's stomach churned as they read the post. The similarities to their own experience were undeniable. They scrolled through the comments, hoping to find advice. Most were dismissive, calling the post a hoax. But one reply caught Alex's attention. If it's tied to a clock, you need to act fast. Shadows like these aren't just spirits, they're entities that feed on time. Every second the clock ticks, it's drawing power. You have to stop it before it fully manifests. Alex stared at the screen, their mind racing. Was the clock really the source of the shadow? And if so, how could they stop it? The thought of destroying the clock crossed their mind, but it felt wrong. It wasn't just an object. It was a family heirloom, something their parents had cherished. But as the days passed and the shadow grew bolder, Alex realized they might not have a choice. One night, Alex woke again at 3 a.m. This time, the shadow wasn't in the corner. It was standing at the foot of the bed, its form more distinct than ever. Alex froze, their breath catching in their throat. The shadow wasn't just a presence anymore. It was becoming something more, a figure, a being. Its edges flickered like static, and though it had no face, Alex could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex whispered, "What do you want?" The room fell silent, the ticking of the clock ceasing abruptly. For a moment, Alex thought they might have imagined it. But then, from the darkness, a faint, raspy voice answered. "Time." The word hung in the air like a thick fog. Time. Alex sat frozen in bed, their mind racing. The voice hadn't been loud, but was unmistakably real, a faint, raspy whisper emanating from the corner of the room. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, pulsing faintly in rhythm with Alex's racing heart. The oppressive weight in the room felt suffocating, as though the shadows themselves were drawing the air out of the space. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed once, breaking the silence. Its tone was lower than usual, a distorted, almost mournful sound that made Alex's skin crawl. They glanced toward the bedroom door, where the faint glow of the clock's face barely illuminated the darkened hallway. For the first time, Alex felt an overwhelming sense of dread toward the family heirloom, a cherished object that now felt sinister, threatening. The next morning, Alex couldn't shake the memory of the voice. They replayed the moment in their mind over and over, trying to convince themselves it hadn't been real. But the more they thought about it, the more certain they became. The voice, the shadows, the timing, it was all connected to the clock. They decided to examine it more closely. The grandfather clock was an antique, its wooden frame polished and well kept despite its age. It had belonged to Alex's grandparents and had been passed down to their parents before eventually ending up in Alex's home. They'd always loved the clock's steady ticking, its soothing presence in the background of their life. But now, standing before it, Alex felt only unease. Opening the glass door that protected the clock's face, Alex inspected the interior. The brass pendulum swung steadily, its rhythm almost hypnotic. Behind it, the faint scratches they had noticed earlier seemed deeper, more pronounced. They ran their fingers over the marks, noting how they crisscrossed in jagged, almost deliberate patterns. It was as though something had been clawing at the wood from within. Further inspection revealed something even stranger. Tucked into a small compartment near the base of the clock was an old piece of parchment. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges brittle. Alex carefully unfolded it, revealing a series of strange symbols and faint, scrawled writing. The text was faded, but one word stood out clearly: Timekeeper. The word sent a chill down Alex's spine. They had never heard of the Timekeeper before, but it felt significant, as though it held the key to understanding what was happening. They placed the parchment on the table and took photos of it with their phone, hoping to research it later. The symbols, though unfamiliar, seemed to pulsate with an unsettling energy, as though they were alive on the page. That night, Alex found themselves awake at 3 a.m. once again. The shadows were worse this time, stretching across the room in jagged, unnatural shapes. The oppressive feeling was stronger, and the faint ticking of the clock seemed louder than ever, echoing like a heartbeat in the silence. Desperate for answers, Alex whispered into the darkness, "What do you want from me?" The room remained silent for a moment, but then the shadows shifted, pulling toward the hallway where the clock stood. The raspy voice returned, barely audible but clear. "Time. You owe it to me." The words sent a wave of terror through Alex. Owe it to me? What did that mean? They scrambled out of bed, turning on every light in the apartment. The shadows receded, but the sense of being watched lingered. Alex stared at the clock, its steady ticking filling the room with an eerie cadence. The words from the parchment echoed in their mind: Timekeeper. Whatever the clock was, it wasn't just a family heirloom. It was something far more dangerous. The next day, Alex dove into research. They searched for anything related to the word Timekeeper and the strange symbols on the parchment. Most results were dead ends, but one link led to an obscure forum discussing cursed artifacts. One post described an antique clock that allegedly trapped the essence of a spirit known as the Timekeeper. According to the post, the clock's original owner had performed a ritual to bind the entity within the timepiece, using it to control the flow of time itself. The post continued, "The Timekeeper feeds on time. If the clock isn't maintained properly, or if the ritual binding it begins to weaken, it will start taking time from those around it. The shadows are a warning, a sign that the entity is breaking free." Alex's heart raced as they read the post. The description matched their experiences perfectly: the shadows, the whispers, the connection to the clock. They scrolled through the comments, hoping to find a solution, but most of the replies were cryptic warnings. One stood out: if the shadows are moving, it's already too late. The Timekeeper has chosen you. The only way to stop it is to sever its connection to the clock. The comment offered no instructions, no explanation of how to sever the connection. Alex felt a surge of frustration and fear. How were they supposed to stop something they didn't even understand? They decided to return to the parchment, hoping it might hold some clue. Late that night, Alex sat at their kitchen table, studying the symbols on the parchment. They had printed out copies of the photos they'd taken and spread them across the table, trying to piece together the meaning. One symbol in particular caught their attention: a circular design with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sunburst. Beneath it was a phrase written in faint, spidery handwriting. At the stroke of 3, time is unbound. The words sent a shiver down Alex's spine. They had been waking at exactly 3 a.m. every night. Was that the moment when the Timekeeper's power was at its peak? If so, what did it mean for Alex's life? That night, Alex stayed awake once again, determined to observe the clock at 3 a.m. When the time came, the room grew cold, and the shadows began to shift. Alex watched as the clock's face seemed to glow faintly, the symbols on the parchment appearing momentarily in the reflections of the glass. The pendulum swung faster, and the ticking grew louder, almost deafening. Suddenly, the clock stopped. The shadows surged forward, coalescing into a single massive form that loomed in the corner of the room. Alex's breath caught as the raspy voice spoke again, louder this time. "Time is mine. You cannot escape." The shadows had become unbearable, the voice an ever-present reminder that Alex's life was no longer their own. They couldn't deny it any longer. The clock was at the center of everything. The whispered words, "Time is mine," echoed in their mind, sending shivers down their spine with every passing hour. Alex needed answers, and they needed them fast. The daylight hours were their only reprieve, but even then, the weight of the situation hung over them like a dark cloud. Desperate for guidance, Alex turned to the internet once more. They searched for forums and articles, anything that could explain the connection between the shadows and the clock. Most of what they found were amateur ghost stories and superstitions, stories about the witching hour and objects cursed to bring bad luck. None of it felt concrete, none of it offered a solution. But Alex was relentless, digging deeper into the hidden corners of the web until he stumbled upon a thread titled Cursed Timepieces, a guide to the Timekeeper. The thread was hosted on a forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The original post described an entity bound to antique clocks, known as the Timekeeper. According to the author, the Timekeeper wasn't a ghost or a demon, but a parasitic entity that fed on moments of life. It would attach itself to a clock, using it as a gateway to interact with the physical world. The post explained that the shadows were manifestations of the entity's influence, growing bolder as it fed on the time of its chosen victim. Alex read the thread voraciously, their fear mounting with every sentence. One section stood out. If you're seeing shadows at 3 a.m., the Timekeeper has already started feeding. It thrives on observation and fear. The more you interact with it, the stronger it becomes. The clock is its anchor, but destroying the clock isn't enough. You must sever its connection, or it will bind itself to you permanently. The post offered little in the way of concrete advice, but the warnings were clear. The Timekeeper was dangerous, and the longer Alex waited, the harder it would be to escape its grasp. One reply to the thread caught Alex's attention. It was from a user with a handle Chrono0, who claimed to have dealt with the Timekeeper before. Their comment was cryptic but chilling. The Timekeeper isn't just bound to the clock. It's tied to the person who awakened it. You can't destroy it by running away or smashing the object. You need to find the source of the bond and break it. The clock holds the answers, but it won't give them up easily. Be prepared to face it head-on. And whatever you do, don't let the shadows reach you. Alex felt a surge of both fear and determination. They had already been avoiding the shadows, but the idea that they could actively reach them was terrifying. They typed a reply to Chrono0, asking for more details, but the account was inactive, their last post dated years ago. It was as if the user had vanished. Still, Alex wasn't willing to give up. They spent the next several hours combing through the forum, piecing together scraps of information. Another thread mentioned a dark website dedicated to cataloging cursed objects and artifacts. The site, according to users, contained detailed accounts of similar phenomena, along with potential solutions for breaking the connections between people and cursed objects. The name of the site was cryptic, Eternal Warden. Accessing the dark web wasn't something Alex had ever done before. They'd heard stories of illegal activity and dangerous content, but the promise of answers outweighed the risks. Following the instructions from one of the forum posts, Alex downloaded the necessary tools and accessed the hidden site. Their hands trembled as they typed in the address. The site loaded slowly, its interface stark and ominous. A dark background was adorned with faint, moving patterns that looked like writhing shadows. The homepage contained a single message in bold red text. Every curse has a beginning. Every anchor has a cost. Enter at your own risk. Alex clicked on the section labeled Artifacts, where hundreds of entries were listed. Each one detailed an object, mirrors, jewelry, paintings, and clocks, along with the stories of those who had encountered them. Scrolling through the entries, Alex found one titled The Timekeeper's Shadow. The entry described an antique clock that had been cursed centuries ago during a ritual gone wrong. The clock, it explained, acted as a vessel for the Timekeeper, binding the entity and limiting its power. But over time, the ritual would weaken, allowing the entity to manifest in the form of shadows. If left unchecked, the Timekeeper would fully escape its vessel, feeding on the time and life of its chosen victim until nothing remained. The entry included a chilling warning. Once the Timekeeper begins to manifest, it cannot be ignored. Destroying the clock without severing the bond will release the entity entirely, and it will bind itself to the nearest living host. To end the curse, you must uncover the ritual used to bind it and reverse the process. But beware, the Timekeeper will not let you go without a fight. Alex felt their stomach churn. The ritual. The parchment they had found in the clock might be the key. They retrieved it, spreading it out on the table again, and examined the symbols with renewed urgency. The circular design with jagged lines seemed central, but they couldn't decipher its meaning. Frustrated, Alex returned to the site, hoping for more clues. One user had posted a detailed account of their own experience with the Timekeeper. They described how the shadows had become aggressive, physically lashing out as they attempted to break the curse. The user claimed that the shadows were strongest at 3 a.m., the moment when the entity's power peaked. They suggested preparing for confrontation, arming oneself with light sources and burning incense to weaken the shadows. But their final words were a grim reminder of the stakes. The Timekeeper is relentless. If you falter, it will take everything from you. That night, Alex prepared for what they knew would be a battle. They surrounded themselves with flashlights and candles, determined to keep the shadows at bay. The parchment was laid out on the table, and the grandfather clock stood ominously in the hallway, its steady ticking a countdown to the inevitable. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the room grew cold, and the shadows began to move. This time, Alex didn't run. They stood their ground, ready to face the Timekeeper head-on. The shadows pulsed, stretching toward Alex as the clock chimed its mournful tone. The confrontation had begun. The ticking of the grandfather clock reverberated through the apartment like a warning, each sound sharper and heavier than the last. At 3 a.m., the clock's chime filled the room, deeper and more distorted than Alex had ever heard before. The shadows in the apartment began their nightly ritual of movement, crawling and shifting along the walls like ink spreading through water. But tonight Alex was prepared, or so they thought. Armed with flashlights, candles, and the parchment they had found, Alex sat at their desk, determined to confront the Timekeeper's growing influence. The dark website, Eternal Warden, had been a revelation, offering fragments of knowledge about the entity and the ritual that bound it to the clock. But much of what Alex had learned felt incomplete, vague hints at the enormity of what they were facing. As the shadows grew bolder, pulsing and stretching toward them, Alex realized the urgency of their situation. They reopened their laptop and logged back onto the site, navigating to the artifacts section. They clicked on the entry titled The Timekeeper's Shadow again, hoping they'd missed something important the first time. The words on the page felt heavier now, more foreboding. The Timekeeper does not forget. It marks those who awaken it and binds itself to their time. If the bond is not severed, it will consume the host's life, moment by moment, until nothing remains. The entry included an updated comment from a user named Watcher192, who claimed to have successfully confronted the Timekeeper. Alex clicked on the comment, their heart pounding. If you've reached this point, you're already in danger. The clock is more than an artifact, it's a doorway. The shadows are manifestations of the Timekeeper's attempts to cross into our world. You must disrupt its connection before the shadows fully form, or you'll be trapped in its grasp forever. Follow these steps carefully. The instructions that followed were chilling. The user described a ritual to sever the bond between the clock and the entity. It required Alex to dismantle the clock entirely, destroying its components in a specific order: the pendulum, the gears, and finally, the clock's face. The ritual also required burning the parchment they had found inside the clock, as it was the anchor that originally bound the Timekeeper. But the final warning sent chills down Alex's spine. The Timekeeper will fight back. The closer you get to breaking the connection, the more it will resist. The shadows will try to stop you. Be prepared. Armed with this new information, Alex steeled themselves for the task ahead. The next night, they set up their workspace in the living room, directly in front of the grandfather clock. The tools they would need, pliers, a hammer, and a small blowtorch, were laid out neatly on the table. They surrounded themselves with candles and flashlights, determined to keep the shadows at bay. At exactly 3 a.m., the clock chimed its haunting tone. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, and the air grew thick with a suffocating heaviness. Alex's breath came in shallow gasps as the shadows began to emerge, stretching across the walls and floor like living things. This time, they moved faster, more aggressively, their shapes flickering and shifting as though enraged. Alex grabbed the hammer and opened the clock's glass panel, their hands trembling. They reached for the pendulum, but as soon as their fingers brushed the brass surface, the shadows surged forward. One of them darted across the floor, snuffing out a candle in an instant. Alex recoiled, gripping the hammer tightly. The whispers began, low and guttural. "Stop. You cannot win." Ignoring the voices, Alex focused on the task at hand. They wrenched the pendulum from its mount, the metal cold and unyielding. The shadows pulsed violently, their movements erratic. Alex could feel their anger, their resistance. They tossed the pendulum into the center of the room, where a metal bin waited to contain the parts for destruction. Next, Alex turned their attention to the clock's inner workings. They pried open the wooden casing, exposing the intricate gears and mechanisms that had kept the clock running for decades. The shadows grew darker, their shapes more defined. One of them stretched toward Alex's hand, nearly brushing their fingers. They grabbed a flashlight and shone it directly at the shadow, which recoiled with a hiss. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You are mine. Stop this." Alex didn't stop. They dismantled the gears piece by piece, their heart racing with every movement. The room felt alive with malevolence, the shadows pressing closer despite the light. When the final gear was removed, the clock stopped ticking. For a moment, the room was silent. Alex thought they might have succeeded. But then the clock's face began to glow faintly, an eerie green light emanating from its surface. The shadows surged forward, their movements frantic and chaotic. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, filling Alex's ears with words they couldn't understand. It was as if the Timekeeper itself was speaking directly to them, its voice a cacophony of rage and despair. Alex grabbed the parchment and held it over the small blowtorch. The symbols seemed to writhe on the page, as though alive. They hesitated for a split second, fear gripping them. What if burning the parchment released the Timekeeper instead of destroying it? What if they were making things worse? But there was no time to doubt. The shadows were closing in, their edges sharp and jagged like blades. Alex ignited the blowtorch, the flame casting flickering light across the room. The parchment caught fire instantly, the symbols glowing brightly before disintegrating into ash. The effect was immediate. The shadows let out an ear-piercing screech, their forms dissolving into wisps of darkness that vanished into the walls. The green light from the clock's face dimmed, then disappeared entirely. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness. For a moment, Alex sat frozen, their mind racing. Had they done it? Was it over? They looked at the clock, now dismantled and lifeless. The shadows were gone, and the whispers had fallen silent. Relief washed over them, but was tinged with doubt. The Timekeeper had been powerful, relentless. Could it really be defeated so easily? As Alex cleaned up the remnants of the ritual, they noticed something strange. The ash from the parchment had formed a faint outline on the floor, a circular symbol with jagged lines radiating outward. It was the same symbol they had seen on the parchment. Alex stared at it, unease creeping back into their chest. The battle might have been won, but the war with the Timekeeper felt far from over. For a brief moment, Alex allowed themselves to believe it was over. The dismantled clock lay in pieces on the floor, the whispers had faded, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. But as the adrenaline subsided, a lingering unease remained. The circular symbol burned into the floor by the ash seemed to pulse faintly, as though it still held some latent energy. Alex tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, but the feeling of being watched persisted. That night, despite their exhaustion, Alex couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant sound, made their heart race. They turned on every light in the apartment, hoping to banish the fear that clung to them. But as the clock struck 3 a.m., the shadows returned. This time, they were different, darker, sharper, and more aggressive. The shadows no longer flickered aimlessly in the corners of the room. They moved with purpose, stretching toward Alex like grasping hands. The realization hit Alex like a cold wave of dread. Destroying the clock hadn't severed the connection. If anything, it had made the situation worse. The Timekeeper's presence felt stronger, more invasive, as though it was no longer bound by the confines of the clock. Alex grabbed a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness, but the shadows recoiled only slightly. They weren't retreating as they had before. Instead, they circled around Alex, testing the edges of the light. Panicked, Alex retreated to their desk and opened their laptop. They logged back onto the dark website, Eternal Warden, their hands trembling as they navigated to the page about the Timekeeper. The entry hadn't changed, but Alex scrolled down to the comments, hoping for new insights. One recent comment from an anonymous user stood out. If the shadows are growing stronger, you've already crossed the point of no return. Destroying the clock doesn't stop the Timekeeper. It releases it. The shadows are fragments of its essence, and they'll keep feeding until they take everything from you. The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. Had they released the Timekeeper entirely by dismantling the clock? The thought was almost too horrifying to process. Another comment offered a sliver of hope. The shadows are trying to bind themselves to you completely. You need to sever the connection by finding the true anchor. The clock was only a vessel. The anchor is tied to the first moment of contact, the event that awakened the Timekeeper. Trace it back to its source. The idea of tracing the curse back to its origin seemed impossible. Alex had no memory of inviting the Timekeeper into their life. They thought back to the first night they'd woken up at 3 a.m., trying to pinpoint anything unusual. The only constant was the clock, but now they knew it wasn't the true source. Could it have been something older, something they'd forgotten? Desperate for clarity, Alex revisited the photos of the parchment they had burned. One image showed a faint inscription they hadn't noticed before, written in the margins of the page. The bond begins in the shadow of time. Break the shadow, and the time will be unbound. The cryptic words made Alex's stomach churn. The shadow of time could only mean the shadows themselves, but how could they break something that seemed intangible? The Timekeeper was growing stronger with each passing night, and Alex felt as though they were running out of time. The next few nights were a waking nightmare. The shadows no longer waited for 3 a.m. to appear. They began manifesting earlier, just after sunset, creeping into Alex's peripheral vision. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent. They no longer sounded like distant static, but like voices surrounding Alex, speaking in unison. Time is mine. You cannot escape. Give in. Alex's attempts to fight back felt futile. The shadows were no longer repelled by light. They moved through it, their edges flickering and distorting but never fully dissipating. Objects in the apartment began to move on their own. The air grew colder, and Alex felt the suffocating presence of the Timekeeper even during the day. It was as if the entity had fully crossed into their world. Determined to find the anchor, Alex combed through every object in their apartment. They searched drawers, closets, and storage boxes, looking for anything that might have been tied to the Timekeeper. One box contained old family keepsakes, including a small notebook belonging to their grandmother. The notebook was filled with meticulous notes about the clock, its maintenance, repairs, and even cryptic comments about its temperamental nature. One entry stood out. The clock was a gift from an estate sale, brought to us from across the ocean. They warned it was a strange piece, but we loved its beauty. It has been ours ever since. The estate sale. Alex's heart sank as they realized they knew nothing about the clock's origins. It had been passed down through generations of their family, but its history before that was a complete mystery. What if the clock had been cursed long before it came into their possession? Alex returned to the dark website, this time searching for threads about cursed artifacts from estate sales. One post described an auction where haunted items had been sold to unsuspecting buyers. Among the listed objects was a grandfather clock, described as elegant but strange, with an aura of dread. The seller had warned that the clock had been the centerpiece of a ritual performed by its original owner, a ritual that had gone horribly wrong. The ritual, according to the post, was intended to trap the Timekeeper, a being that manipulated time and space. But instead of binding the entity fully, the ritual had only contained it temporarily, tethering it to the clock and anyone who owned it. Over time, the entity's influence would seep into the lives of those nearby, manifesting as shadows, whispers, and eventually complete possession. The post ended with a chilling warning. The Timekeeper doesn't just want time, it wants you. If the connection isn't severed, it will take everything. Alex sat back, their heads spinning. The clock's history was darker and more complex than they had imagined. It wasn't just a cursed object. It was a gateway, a tether to a malevolent force that fed on the very essence of life. Destroying the clock hadn't ended the curse. It had released the entity to act without restriction. The shadows were growing bolder, and Alex knew they had little time left. If they couldn't find a way to sever the bond, the Timekeeper would consume them entirely. The thought was paralyzing, but Alex couldn't afford to give up. Somewhere in the clock's history, in the fragments of its story, lay the key to breaking the connection. The whispers began before the sun had even set. Alex sat at their desk, staring at the faint glow of their laptop screen, trying to absorb the horrifying truth. The Timekeeper wasn't bound by the clock anymore. It was loose, its power growing stronger with each passing night. The apartment was no longer just a place to live. It had become a battleground. Every shadow on the wall, every flicker of movement in their peripheral vision felt like a threat. And now it wasn't waiting for 3 a.m. to act. As the shadows thickened around the edges of the room, Alex's laptop chimed with a new notification. It was a message on the dark web forum, Eternal Warden, from an anonymous user, Watcher192. Alex's pulse quickened as they opened the message. The message was short and direct. The shadows aren't random. They're a warning. You're running out of time. The Timekeeper is trying to complete its bond with you. If that happens, there's no going back. Alex typed a frantic reply. What do I do? The clock is gone, but the shadows are stronger than ever. How do I break the bond? The response came quickly. Destroying the clock wasn't enough. The bond isn't tied to the clock itself, it's tied to you. The clock was just the first step. Think back to when this started. What did you do? What changed? Alex's mind raced. They thought back to the first night they had woken up at 3 a.m. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary at the time. The clock had been ticking in the hallway as always, its steady rhythm a comforting presence. But something had changed, something subtle, something they hadn't noticed until it was too late. The shadows crept closer as Alex scrolled through old photos on their phone, hoping for a clue. Then they saw it, a photo they had taken weeks ago, during a routine cleaning of the clock. The image showed the clock's face open, its intricate mechanisms exposed. Alex remembered the moment vividly. They had opened the clock to dust it, something they rarely did. But they had also found something unusual, a faint etching on the inside of the wooden casing. It had looked like random scratches at the time, but now Alex knew better. It had been a symbol. They realized, with growing horror, that this was the moment they had awakened the Timekeeper. By disturbing the clock, they had broken the fragile seal that kept the entity dormant. The shadows, the whispers, the nightly terrors, they were all a result of that single action. Alex typed another message to Watcher 192. I disturbed the clock weeks ago. That's when this started. What do I do now? The reply was immediate. You've invited it in. The shadows are fragments of its essence, feeding on your fear and time. The bond will complete itself unless you sever it. To do that, you need to perform the reversal ritual. But it won't let you finish without a fight. Alex's hand shook as they typed. What's the ritual? Tell me. The response was longer this time, the instructions detailed and chilling. You'll need to gather the pieces of the clock and reconstruct part of it. Use the pendulum, the face, and the central mechanism. Place them in a circle surrounded by salt, with a parchment's ash in the center. Light candles are the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. At 3 a.m., recite the words inscribed on the parchment in reverse. This will unbind the Timekeeper and sever its connection to you. Alex stared at the screen, dread washing over them. Reconstructing the clock felt like inviting the entity back into their life. But if this was the only way to break the bond, they had no choice. The rest of the day was spent gathering supplies and preparing the ritual. Alex retrieved the pieces of the clock from the storage bin where they had been discarded. The pendulum was heavier than they remembered, its brass surface cold to the touch. The clock's face, cracked and worn, seemed to shimmer faintly in the light, as though it still held some residual energy. Alex arranged the pieces in a circle on the living room floor, surrounded by a thick line of salt. When night fell, the apartment grew unnervingly silent. The shadows returned, moving slowly at first, as if waiting for something. The whispers grew louder as the clock approached 3 a.m., their fragmented words forming a sinister chant. Time is mine. You are mine. Time is mine. At 2:55 a.m., Alex lit the candles, their hands trembling. The shadows began to swirl around the edges of the room, their movements frantic and aggressive. The salt circle held them back for now, but Alex could feel their anger, their hunger. They knelt in front of the circle, clutching the page of instructions they had written down from the forum. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the room erupted into chaos. The shadows surged forward, colliding with the invisible barrier of salt. The whispers turned into guttural screams, filling the air with a deafening roar. Alex began reciting the words from the parchment in reverse, their voice shaking but determined. The shadows writhed violently, their forms distorting and shifting as Alex continued the ritual. The light from the candles flickered, casting jagged shapes across the walls. One of the shadows broke through the barrier, lunging toward Alex with outstretched tendrils. Alex grabbed the flashlight and shone it directly at the shadow, forcing it back into the circle. The ritual continued, the words spilling from Alex's lips faster now. The clock's pieces began to glow faintly, their edges vibrating as though reacting to the chant. The air grew heavier, the oppressive weight of the Timekeeper's presence pressing down on Alex's chest. For a moment, they thought they might pass out. Finally, as Alex spoke the last word of the ritual, the room was consumed by a blinding flash of light. The shadows let out one final, ear-piercing scream before vanishing completely. The glow from the clock's pieces faded, and the apartment fell silent. Alex collapsed to the floor, their body trembling. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence of the timekeeper gone. But as they stared at the dismantled clock, a single thought lingered in their mind. Was it truly over? Alex lay on the floor, their breath ragged and their body trembling. The silence in the apartment was unnerving, almost suffocating, after the chaos of the ritual. The shadows had vanished, the whispers silenced, and the oppressive presence seemed to have lifted. But Alex knew better than to trust the quiet. The timekeeper wasn't defeated, not yet. As they sat up, the dismantled pieces of the clock still glowed faintly, their edges humming with residual energy. The ritual hadn't severed the connection completely. Something was missing, some final step that Alex hadn't yet uncovered. They stared at the pile of metal and wood, frustration boiling inside them. Why wasn't it over? What else did it want from me? Determined to find the missing piece, Alex returned to the forum on Eternal Warden. They typed out a frantic post describing everything that had happened, the shadows, the ritual, the lingering energy in the clock's pieces. Within minutes, a reply appeared from an anonymous user with the handle Watcher192. The message was blunt. The ritual wasn't enough. The timekeeper is still tied to you because it hasn't finished feeding. The shadows are fragments of its essence, but the core is still connected to your time. You have to face it directly. Alex's stomach dropped. Face it? How? They typed back. What do you mean? I dismantled the clock. I performed a ritual. What else can I do? The reply came quickly. You need to confront the timekeeper where it's strongest, at the source of its connection. The ritual weakened it, but it won't let you go without a fight. Prepare yourself. The shadows will try to stop you, and the timekeeper will do everything it can to keep it hold. The idea of facing the timekeeper directly sent a chill down Alex's spine. The shadows alone had been terrifying, but the thought of confronting the entity itself felt insurmountable. Still, they knew they had no choice. If they didn't act, the timekeeper would consume their life entirely. Alex spent the rest of the day preparing. They fortified the apartment, placing salt lines along every door and window. They armed themselves with flashlights, candles, and anything else that could repel the shadows. The pieces of the clock remained in the circle from the ritual, their faint glow a constant reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the veil. As night fell, the apartment grew colder, the air thick with anticipation. Alex paced nervously, checking and rechecking their preparations. The shadows didn't appear immediately, but Alex could feel their presence, an unseen pressure that made their skin crawl. At 3 a.m., the apartment plunged into chaos. The shadows surged from the corners of the room, darker and more aggressive than ever before. They moved with terrifying speed, slamming against the salt barriers with enough force to rattle the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent, forming a chorus of voices that seemed to echo from every direction. Time is ours. You cannot escape. Give in. Alex grabbed a flashlight and shone it at the shadows, forcing them back momentarily. But the light didn't hold them for long. The shadows regrouped, their movements erratic and frenzied. It was as if they knew this was their last chance to complete the bond. The whispers grew louder, morphing into a guttural roar as the shadows began to coalesce. They merged into a single massive form in the center of the room, a towering figure of pure darkness. Its edges flickered like static, and its hollow eyes glowed faintly, exuding malice. Alex's breath caught in their throat as they realized they were staring at the timekeeper itself. The entity didn't move at first. It simply loomed, its presence suffocating. Then, in a voice that resonated deep within Alex's chest, it spoke. You cannot break what is eternal. Time is mine. You are mine. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex stepped forward. You don't own me, they said, their voice trembling but defiant. You're nothing but a parasite. And I'm ending this. The timekeeper let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound reverberating through the apartment. You think you can end this? You invited me. You belong to me. The shadows surged forward, crashing against the salt barrier like a tidal wave. The lines of salt began to erode, the fragments scattering across the floor. Alex grabbed the remnants of the clock and held them up, their hands trembling. The pendulum, the clock's face, and the central mechanism seemed to hum with latent energy, as though reacting to the timekeeper's presence. Alex closed their eyes, focusing on the instructions they had pieced together from the forum and the parchment. The Timekeeper was tied to time itself, feeding on the moments it stole. If they could disrupt its control over time, they could weaken it. Alex gripped the clock's face and spoke the words they had memorized from the ritual. Timekeeper, I sever your bond. I reclaim my moments. You have no hold here. The shadows writhed violently, their form distorting and flickering. The Timekeeper let out an enraged roar, its voice shaking the walls. The pieces of the clock began to glow brighter, their edges pulsing with energy. Alex held their ground, repeating the incantation louder, their voice rising above the chaos. The apartment was bathed in a blinding light as the shadows collapsed inward, pulled toward the glowing clock pieces. The Timekeeper's form flickered wildly, its edges unraveling like smoke caught in a windstorm. Its hollow eyes locked onto Alex one last time as it let out a final, piercing scream. This is not the end. With a deafening crack, the Timekeeper's form shattered, the shadows dissolving into nothingness. The light from the clock's pieces faded, leaving the room in silence. Alex stood motionless, their body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, and the apartment felt normal again. Alex sank to the floor, their heart racing. It was over, at least they hoped it was. The clock's pieces were now lifeless, their faint glow extinguished. The shadows had vanished, and the whispers were silent. But even as relief washed over them, lingering unease remained. The Timekeeper's final words echoed in their mind. This is not the end. The quiet in the apartment was unsettling. Alex sat on the floor, staring at the lifeless remnants of the clock scattered in the salt circle. The oppressive presence of the Timekeeper was gone, but the entity's final words echoed in their mind. This is not the end. Exhausted but unable to rest, Alex began to wonder if they had truly severed the connection, or if they had only delayed the inevitable. Determined to understand the full story, Alex turned back to the dark web forum, Eternal Warden. They combed through old threads and comments, searching for anything that might explain the Timekeeper's origins. The details they found were fragmented and contradictory, but a common thread began to emerge. The Timekeeper wasn't just a random curse or malevolent spirit. It was something far older, tied to the very fabric of time itself. One post, written by a user named Temporal Seeker, described the Timekeeper as an ancient entity that predated human civilization. According to the post, the entity had been worshipped by a forgotten culture as a deity of time and balance. These early people believed the Timekeeper controlled the flow of time, deciding when it would slow, speed up, or even stop entirely. But over time, the entity grew hungry for more power, demanding sacrifices in exchange for its blessings. The culture eventually turned against the Timekeeper, creating rituals to bind it and prevent it from interfering with their lives. These rituals required powerful artifacts, objects that could anchor the entity to a physical form and limit its influence. The clocks, according to the post, were just one manifestation of these anchors. The Timekeeper had been bound to various objects throughout history, each tied to a different victim who unwittingly released it. Alex's chest tightened as they read further. The post explained that the Timekeeper's bond with a victim wasn't random. It was drawn to those who interacted with its anchor during moments of vulnerability, times of grief, fear, or desperation. The more attention a victim gave to the anchor, the stronger the connection became, until the Timekeeper could begin feeding on their time and life force. A chill ran down Alex's spine as they thought back to the moment they had opened the grandfather clock. They hadn't been grieving or afraid, but they had been tired, stressed, and distracted. Perhaps that had been enough to create the bond. Or perhaps the clock had been waiting for someone, anyone, to release it. Determined to uncover more, Alex dug deeper into the clock's history. They revisited their grandmother's notebook, flipping through the pages for any mention of where the clock had come from. One entry caught their attention. The clock was acquired at an estate sale from the Morton family. They said it had been in their family for generations. A beautiful piece, though it carries a strange energy. The name Morton felt familiar, though Alex couldn't immediately place it. They searched the name online, adding keywords like estate sale and grandfather clock. After several fruitless attempts, they stumbled upon an old article in a local historical archive. The headline read, "Morton Estate Sale features rare antiques with dark histories." The article described the Morton family as reclusive collectors of rare artifacts, many of which were rumored to be cursed. The clock had been one of the key items sold at the estate sale, drawing significant attention due to its unusual design and supposed supernatural history. According to the article, the clock had originally been owned by a man named Elias Morton, who was known for his experiments with time and occult rituals. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from his home at all hours of the night, and several claimed to have seen shadows moving in his windows, even when no one was inside. Elias Morton's death, the article stated, had been mysterious. He was found slumped over the clock, his body aged far beyond his years. Witnesses described his face as gaunt, his hands clutching the clock's pendulum as if in desperation. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but rumors swirled that he had fallen victim to his own experiments. Alex's stomach churned as they read the final lines of the article. The clock was left untouched for decades before being sold at the Morton estate sale. Several buyers reported strange occurrences, claiming the clock brought misfortune and unnatural phenomena into their homes. Many sought to rid themselves of it, but the clock always seemed to find its way back. The thought sent shivers down Alex's spine. The clock had passed through countless hands before ending up in their family's possession. It wasn't just an antique, it was a vessel, carrying the timekeeper from one victim to the next. And now Alex realized the bond might not have been broken at all. It could still be searching for its next tether. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. They sat in their living room, staring at the disassembled pieces of the clock. The room was eerily silent, but the faint glow that lingered on the clock's components refused to fade completely. It was as if the timekeeper's essence was still there, waiting for an opportunity to reassert itself. As the clock struck 3 a.m., despite being dismantled, a faint whisper echoed through the room. Time is never unbound. Alex's heart stopped. They grabbed the flashlight and shone it around the room, but the shadows remained still. The voice didn't return, but the message was clear. The timekeeper wasn't gone. It was merely dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The whisper lingered in the room like a faint echo. Time is never unbound. Alex sat frozen in the dim light of the candles scattered around the room, their breath caught in their throat. The dismantled pieces of the clock lay on the floor, faintly glowing as if mocking their earlier efforts. The timekeeper wasn't defeated. It had merely retreated, biding its time. Alex realized with a sinking feeling that the final confrontation was inevitable. The entity wasn't going to let them go. Determined to end this nightmare once and for all, Alex returned to the dark web forum, Eternal Warden. They posted a desperate plea for help, detailing everything they had discovered, the clock's history, the ritual they had performed, and the lingering presence of the timekeeper. Hours passed before a response appeared from an anonymous user with the handle Watcher192. The message was concise but chilling. You've weakened it, but the timekeeper isn't bound by the clock anymore. It's tied to you now. To sever the bond, you need to face the entity directly in its domain. The shadows are its gateway. If you hesitate, it will consume you. Alex typed back frantically. What does that mean? How do I face it? The reply came quickly. At 3 a.m., the timekeeper's domain overlaps with ours. You must step into the shadows and confront it on its own ground. It will try to break you, but if you stand your ground and reclaim your time, you can sever the bond. The risk is great, but it's the only way. The thought of stepping into the shadows, the very thing Alex had been trying to avoid, was terrifying. But they knew there was no other choice. The timekeeper wouldn't stop until it had consumed them completely. Alex spent the day preparing. They placed candles around the room, fortified the salt barriers, and gathered the remnants of the clock. The glow from the clock's pieces had dimmed, but Alex suspected they still held a connection to the entity. As the clock neared 3 a.m., Alex sat cross-legged in the center of the salt circle, clutching a flashlight and the instructions they had pieced together from the forum. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the dismantled clock. Alex's pulse raced as the minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. At exactly 3 a.m., the air in the apartment shifted. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. Unlike before, their movements weren't random or chaotic. They converged, swirling together into a single mass in the center of the room. The darkness coalesced into the towering figure of the timekeeper, its form flickering and distorted like a broken projection. The entity's hollow eyes glowed faintly, locking onto Alex. Its voice was deep and resonant, vibrating through the air. You think you can escape me? Time is mine, and so are you. Summoning every ounce of courage, Alex stood. Their voice trembled, but they forced themselves to speak. You don't own me. You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on fear. This ends now. The Timekeeper let out a low, guttural laugh. You cannot sever what has already been bound. Step into the shadows, and I will show you the truth. The swirling mass of darkness expanded, forming a portal-like void in the center of the room. The edges of the shadows pulsed rhythmically, beckoning Alex forward. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but they knew this was the final step. If they didn't face the Timekeeper now, they would never be free. With a deep breath, Alex stepped into the shadows. The world around them shifted instantly, the familiar confines of their apartment dissolving into an endless void of black and gray. The air was thick and oppressive, and the only sound was the faint ticking of an unseen clock. The Timekeeper stood before them, larger and more menacing than ever. The entity raised a hand, and the shadows around Alex began to twist and writhe, forming images. Alex saw fragments of their own life, moments of joy, sorrow, and fear playing out like scenes from a movie. The Timekeeper's voice echoed through the void. I have taken pieces of you, moments you will never reclaim. Look at what you've lost. The images shifted, showing Alex as a child, then as a teenager, then in their current state. Each scene was accompanied by a deep sense of loss, as though the Timekeeper was pulling at the very fabric of their being. Alex fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the memories. You are nothing without me, the Timekeeper whispered. Surrender, and I will make the pain stop. But Alex wasn't ready to give up. Gritting their teeth, they stood, clutching the remnants of the clock they had brought with them. You don't get to decide my time, they said, their voice growing steadier. You can't take what I don't give. The clock pieces began to glow faintly in Alex's hands, their warmth cutting through the cold void. The Timekeeper recoiled slightly, its form flickering. Alex remembered the words from the forum. Reclaim your time. Summoning every ounce of strength, Alex shouted into the void. I take back what you've stolen. I sever your bond. You have no power here. The glow from the clock pieces intensified, radiating light that cut through the darkness. The Timekeeper let out a deafening roar, its form unraveling like threads of shadow caught in a storm. The images of Alex's life faded, replaced by blinding light. The void began to collapse, the oppressive weight lifting as the Timekeeper dissolved into nothingness. When Alex opened their eyes, they were back in their apartment. The dismantled clock pieces lay in the center of the salt circle, now completely lifeless. The air was still, and the whispers were gone. For the first time in weeks, the apartment felt normal. Alex collapsed onto the floor, tears streaming down their face. It was over. The Timekeeper was gone, its bond severed. But even as relief washed over them, a faint echo lingered in the back of their mind. This is not the end.